Well, for more, we're joined in the studio by Liberal MP Jason Falinski, and from Adelaide we have Labor MP Amanda Rishworth. Good morning to you both, and thanks for joining us. Jason, begin with you. In your opinion, is climate change responsible for the fires that we've seen across the country?
Well, as Matt and the Prime Minister said, it's a contributing factor to the bushfires that we've seen in New South Wales and other parts of the country.
Matt made the direct link, though.
Oh, I don't think anyone is making... well, I think that's what the Prime Minister is saying. I mean, there is no doubt that there is a direct link between what is emerging in the climate change, which is setting up the circumstances which has made these bushfires both possible and worse than they should have been otherwise.
This week, the 2020 Climate Change Performance Index ranked Australia last out of 57 countries for its climate policy. It said that it had gone backwards under the Morrison government. Seeing that you are making that direct link and we are seeing climate change play out so seriously, why aren't we doing better on a climate policy?
Well, we just totally reject that study. I mean,
Why?
Is done, well,
what are the reasons?
It has been undertaken by a group or panel of people who clearly have injected politics into this debate. And this is the problem with climate change debate, not just here, though I have to say we're better off than most other nations, but is that there are people who just simply want to shout and make this part of a political debate that they want to have with their opponents, rather than, as Matt Keenan, as the Prime Minister said, we need to listen to the science and act accordingly. That's the problem with, I mean, that study actually goes to exactly the problem that we face in climate science and climate change debate.
Do you think the Morrison government could be doing more, though?
Well, look, let me tell you what we've done. We've done the Snowy Hydro 2.0 thing. We've put in $3.5 billion into the Climate Solutions package. We've put $1 billion into the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. Australia is the largest investor in renewable energy in the world by a factor of 2. That's why under this government, under the Liberal Party, our carbon emissions are 50 million tonnes on average less than they were under the Labor Party. That's how we've managed to cut emissions without cutting jobs.
Before we bring Amanda in, if we can just talk about renewable policy at the election. The Liberal Party and the Coalition attacked Labor for its emissions target, saying it would cost the economy $470-odd billion, up to 330,000 jobs, and push electricity prices up. That is a policy that the Coalition has now adopted, a 50% renewables target. What's changed? Why isn't that going to wreck the economy now?
The renewable energy... there are a number of issues that are being conflated there. The Department of Energy during this week came out and said on current trajectories, 54% of our energy will be produced by renewable energy by 2030. That hasn't required any general setting by the government. That is something that is happening naturally because renewable energy is becoming the cheapest and still not reliable, but is becoming more reliable in its capacity to deliver energy to the grid. The second part was it wasn't the 50% target of Labor's that we were critical of, though we were critical of it. It was the 45% reduction in emissions that we were critical of, and the Fisher report, which went to the cost of that, which included reducing people's wages by $9,000 a year, that was the criticism.
So have your policies, though, come into line?
No, they haven't come into line. We're at 28%. We believe very strongly that we need to adhere to international agreements. That's why we're meeting our Paris Agreement targets. We've met our Kyoto Agreement targets. And we, as we often say, we need to be practical at home and ambitious abroad, or ambitious globally, because this is a global challenge, not just an Australian challenge.
All right, I want to bring in Amanda Rishworth now. Labor hasn't escaped scrutiny on this. Anthony Albanese this week scheduled a tour of Queensland's mining communities, and he defended Australia's coal industry. Did that seem like odd timing, given that we're seeing the drought and the severe bushfires and so many people calling for more action on climate change? Did that seem like an odd time to do that, to come out in defence of Australia's coal communities?
Oh, well, look, firstly, I'd say that I agree with Jason on the fact that we do need to listen to the scientific evidence, but I've sat in the Parliament and watched people on the Coalition side deny that climate change is even happening. But in terms of coal exports, it's inevitable that coal exports are going to be part of the world's mix of energy going forward. But that doesn't mean that we can't have a climate policy, a national climate policy in place here in Australia to make sure that we're on task to meet our Paris commitments. We're not on task to meet our Paris commitments. We do know that the most recent reports have shown that emissions are going up not down in this country. And so we need a national platform to actually make sure that we can meet our Paris commitments. So this is something we need to be directed by the science and not politics. I agree with that. But at the moment, I'm just seeing a whole lot of politics play out in the parliament, particularly from many on the coalition side that are refusing to actually acknowledge that climate change is happening in this country. And we not only need to actually make sure that we're doing our bit to reduce emissions, but we need to seriously look how we adapt in the face of a changing climate.
When you look at leadership, Amanda, from both of the parties' leaders with respect to climate change, what could both be doing better?
Well, look, I think first we need to acknowledge the scientific reality of climate change and the impact that's had. I think the Labor Party has done that. That we don't have a debate within our party about whether or not climate change is real. In fact, I learned about the science at school. It's been around that long. So I think we do need to just get on with the job and actually stop this from being an ideological issue and actually one directed by the science. And if we're directed by the science and we want to limit our warming climate within the 2-degree band, then we need to take action, and we need to stop having is climate change real or not, and get on with the job of how do we actually firstly make sure that we're doing something and playing our role and meeting our targets, which we're not doing now, and indeed adapting to a changing climate and what that means in reality for our communities.
Jason, Amanda mentioned the Paris 2030 target there. It seems that we are on track to meet that if we use carryover credits, and without them we wouldn't meet that target, it seems. The government wants to use these credits, which are essentially emissions that we didn't use in the past that we want to cash in the future. Angus Taylor said this week that that was a legitimate strategy, but over 100 countries want the use of carryover credits banned, and many countries who are entitled to use them have decided not to use them. So do you think that just because we can use them, we should use them?
Well, I guess there are 2 points I'd make. Well, can I firstly start by saying I agree with Amanda. We should stop talking about whether climate change is happening or not. It is happening. The next discussion needs to occur in the Parliament, which is what are we doing about it? I've got to say the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg, Peter Dutton, Matthias Cormann, Minister after Minister has stood up and said that. So I think the government and the Liberal Party accepts that climate change is happening and has done so for quite some time. The second part is what we do internationally needs to be part of an international and global framework. So it's not, at the moment, carryovers are allowed. We can't unilaterally do something because this is a global, well, we can, but this is a global challenge. So we need to be part of global institutions taking steps to reduce this as much as possible, because that is the only way that we are going to get a solution to this challenge.
But rather than cash in ways that mean we do less, essentially, why take that option?
Well, the second point that I was going to make was that when we looked at Kyoto, we were going to use, or people said, the only way we can meet our Kyoto targets is by using our carryover credits. We haven't used any of our carryover credits to meet Kyoto. They're saying that now about Paris. I think that by the time we get to 2030, we'll find we haven't had to use any of our carryover targets. But look, if it's a view globally that we should, that globally we shouldn't be using carryover targets, then that's something that the Australian government is very happy and very eager to sit down in international forums and talk about.
Jason and Amanda, I'll put this both to you, beginning with you, Jason. You both seem to be on the unity ticket with the sense that something needs to be done about the climate. The Prime Minister has expressed unity regarding the fires this week, but has ruled out a national summit on climate, or a COAG meeting.
Right.
Jason, you first. Should there be one?
Well, I think the meeting he ruled out was COAG on the bushfires.
Yes.
There was one in November.
Which would result in a discussion on climate, would it not?
Perhaps, but I think what he was talking about was the COAG meeting on bushfires. There was one in November. He questioned the utility of having yet another one in December, rather than us getting on with the job of putting the bushfires out, which is what we're doing.
Amanda, would a COAG meeting on bushfires be useful to address the climate issue?
Look, Anthony Albanese has called for a COAG summit to really look at what we can do around climate change, but importantly, as I said, how do we adapt? I mean, when we've had firefighters in the field since August, really, fighting fires, they've had significant time off work, they haven't been paid, there's questions around and whether or not we've got enough arterial kind of water bombers available to us. I think we do need to have a national plan and a national meeting about what bushfires look like in a changing climate. Are we prepared enough? Are we coordinated enough? Do we have enough resources? And what is this going to look like going forward? Because it is different than in previous decades, and I think we need to do this to make sure that we're prepared for what inevitably is going to be longer and more difficult bushfire seasons, along with other natural disasters.
Now, we also wanted to touch this morning on the UK election result. We saw Boris Johnson win that election decisively, more decisively than many people expected. Amanda, people are drawing parallels with the election earlier this year in May, where Labor lost that election. Do you see those parallels between Australian Labor and the Labor in the UK in terms of the message being seen as somewhat confusing and them also having an unpopular leader?
Well, look, I haven't been on the ground in the UK, so it's very hard for me to comment. I don't like to comment about things without having spoken to voters. I guess looking from afar, it did seem that one of the predominant issues was Brexit, and that was an issue that galvanised people into two different camps. So it's hard for me to really comment on what was motivating voters, but it definitely seemed from afar that Brexit was a significant issue, and that this had been a country that had been divided from some time since the referendum on Brexit. Really, you've had a divided country that wasn't sure where it was going, a Westminster that was divided, and so in that sense I think that seemed to be, watching from afar, the predominant issue galvanising the election. But of course we've been through our own reflections after the election campaign. We've had a review come down, and that, I think, for me, should really guide us in where we go to next as a Labor Party. And I guess British Labor will be having reflections as well in their loss.
And just before we move on with that, how is that reflection process from the review going? What practical steps is Labor taking? Because we've seen, obviously you mentioned there that Labor in the UK will be undergoing a similar review. You would imagine it's being labelled as moving too far to the left and having not listened to their base.
Well, look, in terms of Labor's review, there were different criticisms about how we could have done things better, and of course we are certainly reflecting on that and taking stock of that. Obviously, our election is not scheduled until 2022, but certainly I know that the Labor Party has taken on and looked at those recommendations very clearly. I mean, what our review did was really talk about some of the mechanics, some of the issues around our strategy, and so we'll certainly incorporate those going forward. So in terms of, though, a divisive issue such as Brexit, we didn't face one of those issues such as that in Australia, and I think one of the things that I've been quite pleased to hear is that the new Prime Minister in the UK has talked about uniting the country, because certainly from someone afar and from so far away, this country, the UK is on the other side of the world, but certainly it seems like the country has been very divided over the last number of years. So hopefully this will put them on a path to healing some of those divisions.
Jason, on Twitter, the Prime Minister Scott Morrison congratulated Boris Johnson, and he said, "Say g'day to the quiet Britons for us." That seems to suggest that he is drawing a parallel, given that he referred to the quiet Australians when he won government. Yeah. And also, how will Scott Morrison be dealing with the new Boris Johnson Prime Minister?
Probably the same way that he was dealing with the old Boris Johnson, which is as constructively as he can. Look, there's no doubt that this opens massive opportunities for Australia and Britain once they leave the EU in terms of trade and other sort of really important investment opportunities. We talk about trade these days, but investment opportunities are actually the really big thing, because when people invest in your country, whether it's us investing in the UK or vice versa or the US, we often bring intellectual property with that as well, which is in the knowledge-based economies that we have globally today, that's really critical and really important. So this is potentially quite good for Australia and very good for the UK.
And do you think he was drawing parallels with, say, G'day to the Quiet Britons?
Look, I think the parallel is that ideas still matter in elections. So we tend to focus a lot on personalities and people, but actually people still, or voters still, care about ideas. And the idea that we saw, I think, playing out here was not the Brexit idea, because that was all very confused, but was really whether you believe in equality of opportunity or equality of outcome. Boris Johnson was very much speaking to people's hopes and aspirations of equality of opportunity. Jeremy Corbyn was saying, I'm going to create equality of outcome. And the result of that was that I think the British people spoke pretty loudly overnight.
OK, well, we are out of time, but Jason and Amanda, thank you both very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.